The battle for Harmony Farm, a tale of legacy and triumph. The screen flickered to life, casting a harsh glow across the room. On it, a furious woman, Margaret Hensley, the iron-fisted president of the Pinewood Estates Homeowners Association, stood red-faced, her voice shrill as she jabbed a finger toward the camera. "You cannot block off the neighborhood's main entrance. This is illegal." The lens swung wildly to me, Ethan Carver, standing beside a towering wrought iron gate, its black surface gleaming under the midday sun. A polished brass plaque bolted to the gate caught the light. National Historic Landmark. I smirked, arms crossed, letting her words hang in the air before responding coolly. "Actually, I can." And I just did. A dramatic silence followed. I turned to the camera, my grin widening. "Let me tell you how my farm, Harmony Farm, the very thing they tried to erase, became their worst nightmare." Rewind a few weeks. Harmony Farm had been in my family for over 150 years, a sprawling, rustic property perched at the edge of Pinewood Estates, a manicured suburban neighborhood obsessed with uniformity. The farm was my inheritance from my grandfather, a weathered but charming relic of a bygone era. Rolling fields, a creaky old barn, and a small herd of livestock. I kept it pristine, not out of obligation, but pride. It was my sanctuary. But to the HOA, it was a blight. Pinewood Estates hadn't existed when my family first staked this land. Back then, it was just fields and forest. Over time, developers carved out their cookie-cutter utopia, building rows of identical beige houses with manicured lawns and strict rules. My farm sat just beyond their jurisdiction, a stubborn holdout from a time before HOA bylaws and aesthetic committees. At first, I thought their disdain was a passing annoyance. Then the letters started. The first one arrived on a Tuesday, crisp and official, stamped with the Pinewood Estates HOA seal. It claimed my barn, an unapproved agricultural structure, violated their neighborhood aesthetic standards. They demanded I either modernize it or tear it down. Noncompliance, the letter warned, would result in daily fines. I stared at the paper, dumbfounded. I wasn't part of their HOA. My land predated their development by a century. Yet here they were, acting like they owned me. I figured a conversation might clear things up. Naive, maybe, but I wanted to believe reason could prevail. So I gathered a stack of deeds and property records proving my exemption and marched into their next board meeting. The HOA office smelled like stale coffee and bureaucracy, its walls plastered with framed rules and regulations. Margaret Hensley presided over the room like a monarch, her sharp eyes scanning me as I approached the podium. "Mrs. Hensley," I began, holding up my documents. "My farm isn't under your jurisdiction. These papers prove it." She barely glanced at them, waving a dismissive hand. "The board has already decided, Mr. Carver. If your property negatively impacts our neighborhood's aesthetics, we have the right to enforce compliance." I blinked, stunned. "My land isn't part of Pinewood Estates. You don't have authority over it." Her smile was thin, almost predatory. "We'll see about that." The next morning, I caught 3 HOA members lingering at the edge of my property, snapping photos with their phones. "What are you doing?" I called, striding over. "Documenting violations," one of them replied smugly, not even looking up. That night, another letter arrived. Fines would now accrue at $500 a day until I took remedial action. My blood boiled. This wasn't just harassment, it was war. The HOA didn't stop at fines. A week later, a demolition notice landed in my mailbox. I read it 3 times, convinced I'd misread the words. Neighborhood Improvement Order, removal of unsafe structure. They were planning to bulldoze my barn. My barn, a 150-year-old piece of my family's soul, reduced to rubble because it didn't match their beige utopia. Fueled by rage, I stormed into their office, the notice crumpled in my fist. Margaret Hensley sat behind a desk, sipping tea like some cartoon villain. "You can't tear down my barn," I shouted. She didn't flinch. "You could avoid this, you know. Modernize the property, a fresh coat of paint, a new fence. It's not hard. You're threatening to destroy my land because it doesn't fit your aesthetic?" I gritted my teeth, leaning forward. She leaned in too, her voice dropping. "It's nothing personal, Mr. Carver. Rules are rules." I drove home, hands shaking on the wheel. That night, my security cameras caught movement. 2 HOA busybodies sneaking onto my property, cameras in hand. They didn't get far. My goat, Brutus, a wiry, ill-tempered beast, charged them, headbutting one into a thorn bush. I laughed watching the footage, but the humor faded fast. This was getting serious. The next day, I called a lawyer, desperate for options. As we spoke, my neighbor Tom, a grizzled old man who'd lived nearby for decades, pulled me aside. "You know," he whispered, "your farm's historic. Ever thought about making it official?" The idea hit me like lightning. If Harmony Farm became a National Historic Landmark, the HOA would lose all leverage. Better yet, they might be legally barred from touching it. I didn't just need a defense, I needed a weapon. And this was it. That night, I dove into research, poring over old maps, deeds, and family lore. My great-great-grandfather, Silas Carver, had used this land as a supply stop during the Civil War. There were even tales of Union soldiers hiding in the barn. I'd always dismissed them as bedtime stories, but what if they were true? What if I could prove it? I called a historian the next morning. Dr. Henry Grayson, a wiry man with a passion for the past, arrived at my farm that afternoon, his briefcase stuffed with papers. We walked the property together, his eyes lighting up as he examined the barn's weathered beams. "This is old," he murmured, running a hand over the wood. "Not just old, historically significant." Then came the bombshell. After cross-referencing archives, Grayson found records of Silas Carver registering the land in the late 1800s. The barn had stored supplies for a local militia. This wasn't just a farm, it was a piece of American history. I started the paperwork that night. The process was grueling: forms, evidence, site evaluations, but I was relentless. Meanwhile, the HOA kept up their assault. Fines piled up. Notices demanded I remove my livestock for disrupting neighborhood harmony. One afternoon, I found men in safety vests surveying my barn. A work order in hand claiming demolition was approved. Over my dead body, I growled, calling my lawyer. He assured me they had no legal right, but that didn't mean they wouldn't try. I installed a full security system, floodlights, cameras, alarms. At 3 a.m., it paid off. 2 HOA lackeys crept onto my land with spray paint, likely to mark the barn. The floodlights blazed, and they bolted, tripping over my fence in a panic. I sent the footage to the local news. The headline ran the next day: HOA caught trespassing on historic farm. The board was livid. I was just getting started. My historic landmark application gained traction. The state approved it first, a major milestone. If I secured national status, the HOA would be toothless. But my lawyer uncovered a twist that made my victory even sweeter. The main road into Pinewood Estates cut through my property, a remnant of an old easement. As a protected historic site, I could restrict public access. I could shut down their road entirely. I laughed when he told me. The HOA had spent months trying to erase me. Now I could erase them. Word spread, and the board panicked. They bribed officials, circulated fake petitions claiming my farm was a community hazard, and hosted a town hall to rally support. It backfired. A retired veteran, Jim Dawson, stood up mid-meeting. "That farm was here before any of us. The HOA's the real nuisance." The room erupted in applause. Neighbors piled on, exposing the HOA's laundry list of absurd fines: garden gnomes, porch chairs, anything that dared defy their beige tyranny. The board shrank in their seats. That night, the HOA president quit. Margaret Hensley, though, dug in her heels. She showed up at my door the next morning, eyes blazing. "You're ruining this neighborhood," she hissed. "Funny," I said, smiling. "I was thinking the same about you." I shut the door in her face. A week later, the letter arrived. Harmony Farm was a National Historic Landmark. The HOA was finished. But I wasn't. With my new status, I filed to restrict the road. In weeks, Pinewood Estates would be cut off. Margaret caught wind and served me a summons 2 days later. The HOA was suing, claiming I'd manipulated historical status to harm them. I laughed. They'd set themselves up for their own downfall. The final approval came on a crisp morning, the National Park Service seal gleaming on the letter. My farm was untouchable, exempt from local rules, zoning, and HOAs. I marched into their office, slamming the papers on their table. Margaret smirked, unfazed. "Historic status doesn't mean you can ignore guidelines." "Actually," I said, savoring every word, "it does. And more." I slid the road restriction filing across the table. Her face paled as she read it. In 2 weeks, that road's closed. No more HOA traffic. The room exploded. You can't do that, Margaret shrieked. It's the only way in. Not my problem, I shrugged. It's my land. I walked out, leaving them scrambling. The fallout was swift. Homeowners stormed the HOA office, furious about the road closure. They didn't blame me. They blamed Margaret. She tried spinning it, claiming I'd tricked the government, but the truth spread. People dug into the HOA's history of harassment. A petition to oust the board gained hundreds of signatures. The treasurer resigned, then 2 others. The neighborhood voted to dissolve the HOA entirely. I celebrated the day the road restriction took effect with a barbecue, inviting the whole town, except Margaret. We ate, drank, and laughed. Someone hung a sign on my gate. Welcome to Harmony Farm, a National Historic Landmark, HOA-free since 2025. Margaret screeched up in her car, storming toward me. You think this is over? Oh, it is, I said, pointing to the locked gate. No trespassing. She stomped off, defeated. Margaret didn't give up quietly. She circulated flyers claiming I'd tanked property values, but no one cared. The HOA was dead, and people reveled in their freedom. Pink flamingos sprouted on lawns, a rebellion against her reign. When she tried issuing fake fines, a retired cop caught her on camera. The police warned her off, and the IRS soon came knocking. An accountant uncovered $100,000 missing from HOA funds, money Margaret controlled. She fled town under a cloud of fraud, her house sold in a hurry. The neighborhood bloomed without her. People painted houses wild colors, built quirky yard art, and lived free. I turned Harmony Farm into a museum, showcasing its Civil War history with tours and a farm store. The annual HOA-free festival became a hit, complete with a dunk tank featuring a Margaret mannequin. A developer offered millions to buy my land for condos. I laughed him off. Protected landmark, I said. No sale. He drove away, and I unveiled a stone monument by the gate. Welcome to Harmony Farm, a National Historic Landmark, HOA-free since 2025. In loving memory of the HOA, may it never return. The war was over. I'd won, not just for me, but for everyone they tried to control. Harmony Farm stood as a testament to resilience, a legacy no one could touch.